Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us for the second workshop in our Living with PTSD series. I'm Leanne Tormey, Voices Director of Programming. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters to you. Dr. Lisa Ann Cucurullo is a clinical psychologist whose current work is focused on facilitating the use of empirically supported treatments by clinicians treating veterans in rural areas. Her clinical work has focused on cognitive behavioral treatments for PTSD and other post-trauma related symptoms. She's trained in cognitive processing therapy and is a consultant at the VA's national rollout of prolonged exposure. Dr. Cucurullo received her doctorate in clinical psychology from LaSalle University and completed her clinical internship and PTSD-focused fellowship at Southeast Louisiana Veterans Healthcare System. We also have Dr. Rebecca Mateo, who is a health science specialist and web contact manager for VA's National Center for PTSD Executive Division. Her primary role includes the creation and maintenance of educational materials and products for veterans, mental health providers, and the general public, which are largely disseminated via the center's website. She's a key contributor to the center's annual PTSD Awareness Month campaign, and is engaged in plain language and mental health literacy efforts. She received her PhD in medical sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Please join me in welcoming them both. Ladies, it's great to have you. And Lisa, we're going to turn it over to you.
So I know Rebecca and I are excited to be with you today of part 2 of 3 about living with post-traumatic stress and treatments for PTSD, which is what we're going to focus on today. This is a little bit, I know you just read our bio, so this is also a little bit about us. And then, like any good government employee, Rebecca and I want to share with you that the information and views we share today are our own, and we do not represent the VA or the United States government in this talk. But it's important to tell you who we work for and how we are sort of well qualified to give this talk today. So both Rebecca and I work for the National Center for PTSD Executive Division, and our mission at NCPTSD is to advance the clinical care and the social welfare of America's veterans and others who have experienced trauma or who suffer from PTSD. And we do that through research, education, training in the science, the diagnosis, and the treatment of PTSD and other stress-related disorders. So our job today is to come together to familiarize you all with the clinical practice guideline for PTSD, to understand the treatments that work for PTSD, give a little brief understanding of them, talk a little bit about what it's like to do those treatments, and to then be able to identify and find resources related to PTSD treatment on our NCPTSD website. So it's important to think about what are clinical practice guidelines. Now, we have clinical practice guidelines for almost every disorder in healthcare, right? It's when we have experts come together to look at the state of the research and then say, okay, given the current research that has been conducted, what do we know that the research tells us is best practices? Or how do we rank those practices to show people that, within the research, there's a gradient of things that we could use to treat a certain disorder? And how do we assist and help people in their clinical decision-making? So guidelines are not intended to define a standard of care. So this is important to understand, because if a guideline dictated care, it would be every person with PTSD gets this treatment. But we know that that can't really be true, because everyone is existing in different contexts, has different nuances to what's going on in their lives. And a lot like what we discussed last time we were here, that there are so many symptoms of PTSD. You have a criterion A stressor and 20 symptoms. And so with that, it's important to acknowledge that, we have the ability and to have a PTSD diagnosis that doesn't look like maybe the person who might be sitting next to us or the person who sits in the chair after us who also has PTSD. So we want to acknowledge that these guidelines are not about you must do a certain treatment, but it is there to help inform us as clinicians, but also any patients that there is research on this. And how do we digest that and make it a bit easier to understand? So with that, we have multiple groups who do clinical practice guidelines. So the great part is that that those of us at NCPTSD who work at the VA and the DoD, yes, we help support our own clinical practice guideline, which is the VA DoD clinical practice guideline for PTSD. But we also have amazing, great colleagues who also do work to create PTSD guidelines. So here in the US, we have the American Psychological Association, who has a clinical practice guideline of PTSD. Internationally, we have ISTSS, which is the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. We also have the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. We have the Australia Center for PTSD Mental Health, and they have a guideline. So NICE has a guideline, and NICE, you might know that acronym because they are the English/Great Britain healthcare system, as well as Phoenix being Australia. So we have an international, we have Great Britain, we have Australia, and we have two here in the United States who write clinical practice guidelines for PTSD. So here's something to note. I put Jessica Hamblin, who is our Deputy Director of Education at the National Center for PTSD. She wrote an amazing clinical paper that really talks about what are the differences between these guidelines. Where are places where, as all these groups, where has there been consensus, and where has there been places where there was some departure? And then let's talk a little bit more about what those look like. So I have a few slides related to that. Let's see if I can advance my slides. There we go. So first, when we're talking about clinical practice guidelines for PTSD, what is really important to remember is that most people, when they're talking to their providers about receiving PTSD treatment, really talk about two different types of treatments for the most part. One being psychotherapy and the other being pharmacotherapy or medication. So when we're thinking about psychotherapy, you can see here that there are multiple types of recommendations, whether that's a strong, moderate, very low, or insufficient information to be able to make a recommendation on, or an emerging recommendation, which is there may be some promising work being done, but there's not enough for any one group to say, yes, this is something we should be keeping an eye out for or sort of mine this space. But what you'll be able to know in this group that sort of like goes across and looks at each of the types of guidelines is that many of these guidelines are agreeing on one specific type of psychotherapy being a strong recommendation. And that's a cognitive behavioral trauma-focused treatment. Now, if you look across in each of these guidelines, it all is strongly recommended, which is amazing to say. We had all these groups of national and international experts, and they looked at all of the literature, and that came out on top for all of the groups. Now, what you might be saying, Lisa, is like, that's really great, but how come all these lists don't look exactly the same if they're looking at the literature, right? So a few reasons why they don't look exactly the same. One is that some of them were done in different years. So if you look at the Australia guidelines done in 2013, that had different studies they were looking at and different data than our own done in 2017, or even the NICE guidelines in 2018. What's also important to know is that each guideline didn't use the same rubric for how they looked at research and what research they included to make these recommendations. So it is not just sort of like one standard set or rubric to say this is the research that we'll include, and then this is how we'll synthesize that information to make our recommendations. If that was true, then we would only need one guideline, right? If we asked everyone to do it exactly the same way. So each of these have a different methodology as to how they looked at the research to make these recommendations. But I think the good news story out of this slide is that a trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is the first line treatment on all of these. Now, the APA version actually named those specific treatments, but all of those treatments, cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure, are there under the strong recommendation. So now if we're thinking about pharmacotherapy, right? So we're looking at medication. What you're going to notice is that for strong recommendations, no one but the VA DoD identified medication as a strong recommendation for treatment. That in fact, if we're going to go back to that last slide, there were many options for strongly recommended. In here, there are not. And so this is important to think about for you when you're looking at, well, if people examine the literature, only one group identified that there is a strong recommendation for particular pharmacotherapies, and that's our VA DoD clinical practice guideline that recommended fluoxetine, paroxetine, sertraline, and venlafaxine. But what's important to also know is that even in our guidelines, despite saying we strongly recommend these 3 medications, what we also identified is that even though it's strongly recommended, it does not work as well. And we don't recommend it as much as we recommend trauma-focused psychotherapy, individual trauma-focused psychotherapy to be precise. So we have some agreements, right, that individual trauma-focused psychotherapies are the first line treatment across the board. And that, in fact, we have 2 and even a few more emerging trauma-focused psychotherapies that are cognitive behavioral in nature. The 2 most studied cognitive behavioral psychotherapies are prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. So let's talk a little bit about them. But when we're talking about them, I want you to keep in mind this idea, and I love this icon that we have on our National Center website, and oftentimes we print it out as posters or as backgrounds, which is that trauma-focused psychotherapy works, right? And that in fact, if you do it as prescribed, that 54 out of 100 people who do these trauma-focused psychotherapies no longer meet clinical criteria for PTSD about 3 months after treatment. In the same way, if you move in the direction towards medication, which was recommended highly, 47 out of 100 will no longer meet clinical criteria for PTSD after about 3 months. But we also know if you do nothing, if there's no treatment, after 3 months, only about 12 people will no longer meet criteria for PTSD. And so we know doing nothing does not yield the best results. And what does yield the best results are those trauma-focused psychotherapies. Another piece to notice for this is that trauma-focused psychotherapy is time limited, right? It's about 3 months, 3 to 4 months, depending on how often you're meeting. But if you are to take medication, you would need to consistently maintain medication. And so there's a difference from dedicating 3 to 4 months to your mental health and your PTSD diagnosis in the hope of alleviating symptoms and not meeting full criteria anymore for PTSD, to then also the decision of going on medication and then sustaining medication over the long-term period. And so those are 2 thoughts as you're thinking about what treatment might be a good fit And we're going to talk in a little bit about how do we determine what treatment's a good fit for me. This is something to think about for yourself, which is what's the investment that you are going to put in time-wise and the consistent investment you will need to be successful, to hopefully be in that 54 and 47%. So let's talk a little bit about prolonged exposure, or PE, right? We shared we don't have any conflicts of interest, and our disclaimer that we don't represent the VA and that our thoughts are our own. So I feel free to share this, that PE is my favorite treatment to do. So you can take that with a grain of salt, that as the clinician, I love to do PE. And so what type of treatment is PE? It's one specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and it teaches you to gradually approach trauma-related memories, feelings, and situations that you've been avoiding since your traumatic experience. And how does that work? Because it seems counterintuitive, right? PTSD, if you were here for our last talk, we talked about the hallmark symptom of PTSD being avoidance, right? So if we're doing PE and my PTSD and my gut is telling me to avoid, and you're telling me a great treatment for PTSD is one that has you approach, how does that work and why? And mostly it's because confronting challenges, especially ones that you have identified as dangerous or unsafe, or that you're not capable of handling them, right? That when you go out there and do them, you'll see that the worst case scenario doesn't happen and that you're able to handle it. But also, really importantly, it shows you that all those experiences, right? That high intensity of distress when you go and do these things that you've been avoiding for a long time, that the more you do it, the easier it gets, because you're beginning to realize how there wasn't a whole lot that those unhelpful thoughts were based in. And so PE requires you to go out in the world, to go and do those things that you've been avoiding. And it also requires you to talk about your trauma memory and to go over it with your provider in order to really connect and have an emotional engagement with that experience. Because we know avoidance is such a hallmark, and it's what keeps PTSD present in your life, doesn't only make sense that we have a treatment that targets avoidance. So if we're looking at CPT, or cognitive processing therapy, it's also another specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. And it teaches you how to evaluate and change upsetting thoughts you may have had since the trauma. And by changing your thought patterns, you can also change how you feel. And we've all had that experience, right? Of having this thought that brings us down emotionally. And if we really examine that thought, we'll likely be able to change how we feel during the day. So how does that even work, right? How do we change our thoughts? And part of that is really looking at thinking patterns. And what are ways that our thinking patterns may have changed since the trauma? And how do we really be willing to examine them to help us? So trauma can change the way we think about ourselves, the world, and the people around us. We can get stuck in unhelpful thoughts, things like we might be to blame, or things like other people or the world are dangerous, or I'm not capable. And these thoughts keep you stuck in PTSD. Of course, if we don't think that we're capable, or we think we're to blame, then we're not going to be out engaging in the world in the same way as we were if we thought we were a capable person who has a good relationship with other people. And so we miss out on things that we used to enjoy. And CPT teaches you new ways to handle these unhelpful, upsetting thoughts so that we can move forward and have a more balanced thought. So when we're thinking about, great, we have two treatments that work, and we have those two treatments are sort of well identified, not only here in the US, or not only for veterans, or not only for people who have experienced sexual assaults, which are a lot of the people who we study. But in fact, internationally, everyone has agreed that these are really the go-to treatments. So what do we do then? How do we determine which one might be best for us? And part of that is to think about shared decision-making. Now, our clinical practice guideline, the VA-DoD clinical practice guideline, recommends engaging our patients and everyone we work with in shared decision-making. And this includes educating people about effective treatments, but it also is about building a relationship related to what you want out of treatment. And so this starts with sharing what are our treatment options, including those options that might not be first line recommended treatments. As long as everyone knows that these treatments don't have as much empirical support or haven't worked as well in the research, those are just conversations to have. Doesn't necessarily preclude anyone from getting those treatments. And it helps you understand that choice exists, that you have the ability to determine what treatment you want, and that those of us are providers, as providers, are here to share what our expertise is, what treatments we feel capable and trained to do. And if we don't feel capable or trained, how do we connect you to someone who is? And for you to be able to see the pros and cons of each treatment. No treatment is perfect or doesn't have a pro and a con, but in fact, everyone does. And for you all, you should be looking at, in my life, what are the pros and cons? You know what, maybe I have some childcare issues, or maybe I'm helping with an elderly family member or loved one in my life. Maybe I have a job that requires lots of hours. Those can influence what treatments might be the best fit for you. And then to really provide information about all the treatment options so that you all can make wise decisions about what works best for you and what fits into the context of your life. And to also compare the treatment effectiveness, right? If two treatments look like they could be good choices for you, maybe it's time to look at the research and say, hey, if more people get better with one than the other, maybe that's the right choice for you. And to also think about your own understanding in what the sort of the relationship of doing therapy together needs for everyone to be successful. So for both of these treatments for PTSD that we talked about, in both of them, there's work to be done at home, that you need to dedicate time and energy, whether that's after work or after other engagements that you have in your life. There is work to be done every day for each of these treatments. Maybe that's feasible for you, and maybe it's not. But part of that is checking the understanding about what is necessary to be successful. And do we have all those components, right? And there's a piece of understanding there and honest communication with your provider that will be helpful. And you have your own values, as you should, right? How do we share those values with our provider? How do we tell them that maybe there's something that might be more important than doing homework every day, like childcare or supporting someone who is older or sick in your lives? There's lots of things that are part of the context of your specific life. And so we want you to be having those conversations with your provider to help you then decide on the treatment. And this decision is important, right? Because not only is it, okay, I'm moving forward, but it's also the commitment to do all of the things that it will mean to be successful in that treatment moving forward. So whether that's weekly psychotherapy appointments, maybe that's twice weekly psychotherapy appointments, whether that's the commitment to carve out time in your everyday life to do your at-home work. You know, this might be a great time because it's summer and say you have kids and they're at camp, and so you have a lot of opportunity to do work. Or it's summer and your kids are not at camp and they're at home every day, and it might not be a great time to do a treatment where it's going to require hours of work. So part of that is being able to then decide and then carve out that time, create a plan to be successful. And here's what we know you all as patients want from us. So don't be afraid to ask for it. So how much time do you want to spend talking about treatment? And here's the thing, such a large portion of you want a huge chunk of time to be talking about treatment, right? If we have about 45 to 60 minutes in a therapy session, you want to spend most, if not all of that time talking about possible treatment options. And so it's important to acknowledge that if this is something that feels rushed to you, or you don't feel like you're getting all the information, to be honest with your provider, to take a step back and say, hey, I'd like to take some time to think about this, and give us a time to be able to chat really thoroughly about each of these treatment options, including things that may or may not be able to happen with that provider. And that you need some time to consider treatment options. We didn't ask this, but my guess is because you'd want to talk about this with your trusted people in your lives, whether that's family or friends. How much time do you really want to consider treatment options? A very large percentage of you said that you wanted at least a few days, if not a week, to discuss what might be the best treatment approach. And I think that's reasonable and understandable given the commitment. So if you feel like you're being pushed in one direction, or you're being asked to make a decision when you're not consulting with the people that are important to you, just ask for more time. You will be with other people who also have PTSD, who want time. And I think that's okay as long as you communicate that to your provider. So when we think about, we have treatments that work, we have them supported by multiple clinical practice guidelines, and there is a framework for you to decide what treatment is best for you. That's amazing. And you might want to do some work on your own. So I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca, to determine, what are some resources that we have at NCPTSD that can help you learn more about these treatments, think about them, and think about your own treatment trajectory, and to hear from other people who might have gone through it.
Thank you, Lisa. And I will say that I love working with Lisa because she is so able to both explain high-level concepts and help you understand the process, not just, what therapy is, but kind of the process piece. And suffice it to say, not all clinicians are as talented as she is at that. So that's where some of these resources will come in really handy. And as Lisa said, whether it's that you need time to process, to learn about your options, you want to share the treatments you're thinking about with either a provider or someone, a close friend, family member who you want to help make that decision with you or help you process that information, we at the National Center have created a number of resources that both work to explain treatments and help you understand the process of what it's like to get treatment, both from people who've been there, as well as from providers who you may be interacting with. So next slide. Really quickly, last time we met, I introduced our website, and I'd like to do the same today. And this is our main homepage. And if you click again, Lisa, I'm going to be focusing today primarily in this Understand PTSD Treatment section. And again, when you come to our website, we sit within the VA landscape. So there's a tab section on the top of the page that I just conveniently cut off here. But when you're on our website, this left navigation is really where you're going to find most of the things that you need and the content that I'm going to talk about today. I have the URL on the website, and my understanding is that Leanne's going to share a handout we've put together that has the links for all of these resources. So don't hesitate, don't worry, we'll be able to get you access to all of these things after we talk today. Okay, so the next slide shows you an example of one of our text-based web articles. And for those of you who are really inclined to just read about different treatments, this is a great place to start. They're easily shareable. You could print out these pages. But I also want to show you, this is the example of prolonged exposure for PTSD, and we have similar pages, not just for the most effective evidence-based treatments, but for other emerging treatments as well, that can help you kind of see the landscape or help you understand treatments that are being talked about in the media that maybe aren't quite there yet in terms of the research evidence, but to give you a way to kind of get a baseline. So if you click again, Lisa, on all of these web articles, we have a little summary section at the top, and you can see it tells you about how long it'll take you to read. It gives you kind of the basis of what the whole article itself is about. And I also want to say that next click on these treatment pages, we found it was really important to kind of help you dig in a little bit more. And so we include videos where you've got providers talking to different aspects of each of these treatments. So for example, we've got a provider speaking to what is prolonged exposure, another video clip on how prolonged exposure works, another video that speaks to what to expect if you're in prolonged exposure therapy, and so on. And so you can both read and listen in these pages, which I think is really great. If you click again, Lisa, if you read this page and you think, I want to learn more, or I really want to know what the studies are, you may be one of those intellectually attuned folks, or somebody who enjoys reading the research literature. If you click on the provider version, this is accessible to everyone. You don't need to be a provider, but we base these public-facing pages off of more in-depth provider-facing content, and you can find the links to articles that are cited that we develop this content from. So I want to show that to you to encourage you, if you're really wanting to see the studies and the research evidence, you can click that provider version and get more information. And then finally, I just want to give a nod to the fact, if you click again, Lisa, a lot of this information is available in Spanish as well. And so you'll see that link at the top of the page when there's a coinciding Spanish version. Obviously, the Spanish version won't include the videos. We need providers who speak Spanish to offer that. We're working on it. But for now, you can see the content and share it that way. Okay, next slide. If I mentioned these the last time we met, but really focused on the kind of what are PTSD symptoms piece of it. These are our Understanding PTSD Treatment and Treatment booklet series. These are PDF booklets. You can view them online. You can download them. And if you see the print materials link there on the left, that's where you can download them. And on that print materials page, there's also a link to the government printing office where you can actually go and order printed copies for free delivered to you, and you can get multiple copies. So if you work in an office or you're part of a support group or a peer group, you can have these delivered to you free of charge. And these are great. They have, again, text-based information, but then they also have beautiful photos of veterans who have been there, quotes from them talking about their experiences with PTSD and treatment. The Understanding PTSD and Aging booklet talks about the experience of PTSD in older adults, both those who may have developed PTSD later in life, or those who had PTSD at an earlier point in their life and are experiencing symptom exacerbation, or maybe their symptoms have changed over time. And this booklet is really geared at those in the older population and their loved ones to help learn about how PTSD may impact them differently and ways they may be able to manage that as well. And then the next slide, I do also want to note that on our website, the treatment section is a lot of text-based information about what the treatments are. But if you click again, Lisa, our Get Help section is intended to help you find treatment. It's sometimes easier said than done, and we recognize this. So you'll see that in this section, we have crisis information. So if you have just gone through a trauma, you find yourself kind of in a critical distress mode, you're really heightened with symptoms, or you're really struggling, we've got a crisis link there that will take you to 911, Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and for veterans, the Veteran Crisis Line. I've chosen to show you the Find a Provider page because this is really our go-to content for anyone who has experienced a traumatic event and wants support. And so we give you on this page just some things to think about. We mention again what those key therapies are. So if you do start looking for a provider, you can say that you're really interested in one of these therapies. Ways to work with your insurance company to ensure that you're finding a provider who's within your network. We give you ways to search both in Google. If you're using a phone book, we try to give you multiple avenues to help you locate the help you might need. So in this section as well, at the bottom of that orange box, you see self-help and coping. I do want to mention that we have resources on our site that are not intended to replace therapy by any means, but if you're someone who's been through treatment, you're someone who's been through a trauma and haven't risen to the level of PTSD symptoms, you're supporting someone with PTSD and you need a little coping yourself, these self-care resources are really great. We've got everything from information about mindfulness and meditation. We also have information in this section on therapies that you may read about in the news, and they're just not quite proven yet. So we have content here on dogs and PTSD, so emotional support dogs, and not quite a PTSD proven therapy, but acknowledging the role that dogs may play in helping you get through your daily life. Okay, so the next section, we're going to try and get really fancy here. Last time we didn't have our videos work, but if you back up, Lisa. Okay. We're going to try and play this video here that will show you, like in 4 minutes or less, an overview of PTSD treatment options. We have a series of these on our website. We've got one for each of those primary therapies that Lisa spoke to. We've also got one that explains what it means to call a therapy evidence-based, as Lisa explained some of that research and clinical practice guideline process, just to help explain. So fingers crossed, hopefully this works and you can hear it.
So, you've been diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You might be thinking, does therapy for PTSD really work? Or what about medications? Well, there are treatments that work and you have choices. We're going to show you PTSD treatments that are evidence-based, which means they've been proven to work in multiple scientific studies. Two of the most effective PTSD treatments are cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure. Both are cognitive behavioral therapies, CBT for short. CBT is far from just talking. You'll learn skills to manage your PTSD symptoms. Cognitive processing therapy teaches you how to change negative thoughts about your trauma, which can have a big impact on how you feel. Prolonged exposure helps you confront memories and situations you've been avoiding since your trauma. This gets easier with time, and eventually, you won't need to avoid them. Another effective therapy is EMDR, which involves thinking about images and feelings that distress you while doing rapid eye movements. This can help you change how you react to trauma memories. Therapies like these usually take 3 to 4 months of weekly visits, and improvement can last for years. Medications are another effective option. The best medications for treating PTSD symptoms are antidepressants, specifically SSRIs and SNRIs. Antidepressants work by helping brain cells communicate better, and that can make you feel better. Improvements in your PTSD symptoms will last for as long as you keep taking them. You might have heard about benzodiazepines, or benzos. In the past, doctors prescribed these anti-anxiety medications for PTSD. New research shows anti-anxiety medications may interfere with therapy and do not improve PTSD. These medications can also lead to harmful side effects like confusion, fogginess, and accidents or falls. If you're taking benzodiazepines or other medications with potentially harmful side effects like atypical antipsychotics, talk to your doctor about whether you should safely stop them. There are more effective options for PTSD. It's common to have other problems at the same time you have PTSD, like chronic pain, depression, substance abuse, a history of traumatic brain injury, or insomnia. Often, treatments effective for PTSD can help with these problems too. In other cases, your doctor might suggest an additional treatment. For example, there's a special type of cognitive behavioral therapy called CBTI. The I is for insomnia. CBTI teaches you skills that can improve your sleep, even after just a few therapy appointments. Some antidepressants can help with sleep too, and there is a medication called prazosin specifically for nightmares. So, where do you start? Talk to your provider about which effective treatment options are right for you. Therapy, medications, or maybe both. And remember, it's always important to talk to your doctor before stopping or switching medications. For more information, visit the National Center for PTSD website at www.ptsd.va.gov. To find a mental health provider, click the Get Help for PTSD button or see success stories at About Face.
So you can see these videos are also, you can share them via email, you can share them with a friend. It helps take the explaining out of your hands if that's helpful for you. And then, as I mentioned, the ones that are based on specific treatments really dig into the therapies a little more. And so more treatment explaining. This is more of our overview video. All right, next slide. I mentioned last time we met as well About Face, and you'll see that many of the photos of the veterans here on the landing page for About Face are used in our other products, both on our website more broadly, also in our Understanding PTSD Treatment booklet series. About Face has pretty much changed all of our educational products at the National Center, and for good reason. This website includes real stories of veterans who have experienced PTSD and gone through evidence-based therapy. And we have, I think, currently over 95 veterans who talk about their unique experiences on the site. We also have family members who speak to what it's like to live with someone who's gone through PTSD treatment or experiencing symptoms, and then clinicians who speak to their experiences. So I'm going to dig into the family member next time we meet. But I want to share some examples with you because I think the words, the images, the emotion that come through in these videos are really engaging and I think a really valuable resource. So next slide, Lisa. So this first video is a compilation. Most of the videos on About Face, you can select a question and see multiple veterans answer that question, or you can select a veteran and hear them respond to a number of different questions. So it's got both directions here. But what our producer, director, Vicki Bippard, who does the videos, does the interviews, and then manages the website is created these really fantastic compilation pieces where she's pulled together segments from a number of different veterans responding to the same question. So this one is a series of veterans speaking to what PTSD treatment was like for them.
It's not easy going in there and telling people about your issues that you haven't told to anybody. But you got to keep doing it because there's going to be that one little spark, that one little light bulb that lights up that says, that's a technique that I can use.
It's very important to unlock what caused the PTSD so that you can forgive yourself for one thing and understand, why you're coping so poorly and knowledge is power, so it empowers you.
With prolonged exposure and reliving the instance over and over and over and over, yes, I'll say it again, over and over again, the memory doesn't fade. The intensity behind it does. And I learned with the prolonged exposure by reliving some of the most scariest moments of my life when I was in Iraq, you learn that it's there, but the intensity of the memory goes away.
One of the exercises to get over that fear of the overpasses was to actually go underneath a bridge, drive underneath the overpass and face my fears, really.
When you can walk through it with a trained professional, and that doesn't mean your buddy or your buddies that went through it with you, that means a trained professional. If you can walk through it with them, they have a way of making you look at it from all the angles, not just the one perception that you have. You look at it from all the angles. And that's what it took for me, was to look at it from many different angles. Not saying it was right or wrong, it was just looking at different angles to give me a different mindset. And hopefully, and for me, it allowed me to see things a little bit differently and a little clearer and make a little more sense of what happened that day.
My thing with can't trusting anybody. Well, they took me out of that and said, now, anybody? That's quite a overall general statement. I mean, you trust your wife now, don't you? Yes. You trust the people in this room now, don't you? Yes. So it isn't that you can't trust anybody. And they gave me the tools to start looking at things like that.
By writing about the different scenarios that happened in my life that traumatized me, it was like releasing within myself these things that happened and coming to understand what really happened in my life and that it was not my fault.
I really struggled with medication for a long time. That, to me, having to be on medication meant I was really broken. I was really screwed up. So I would get on it and things would get better and I would get off of it. And then things wouldn't be better and I'd get back on it and things would be better, so I'd get off of it. And I was driving my psychiatrist crazy because she was just like, stay on the pills. So eventually I pushed through all of that and have since been able to lower my dosage of medication because I don't need as much.
It teaches you about yourself. And sometimes people can see things that you can't see in the mirror. That you need outside resources to help you.
When I was finally able to access it, it was like I was finally able to start living again. So my first session, I still remember it till this day. It was like the new beginning for me.
So you can see really powerful testimonials about the treatment experience in general. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to show you in this clip, Leah Parody, who is a U.S. Air Force veteran. Oop, click again. Sorry.
This one?
No, yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
This is Lisa Parody, a U.S. Air Force veteran, and she's going to speak more specifically about her experience in cognitive processing therapy. So we also have clips where veterans really drill down into particular treatment experiences.
At heart. So the worksheets really helped me write down and get some thoughts down on paper that I could talk to and use with my therapy to work through a whole bunch of different traumatic events. So the traditional CPT lasts for 12 weeks, but I was in that for a lot longer, but we went through multiple different events that I wanted to work through. But it was emotionally taxing, it was relieving, it was overwhelming, it was stressful, but in the end it was great because I worked through this stuff and I'll never forget about it, but I can think about it and talk about it without being completely overwhelmed by it now.
And I think one of the other pieces of these testimonials is how the veterans, those who've been through the treatment, are really able to explain the treatment. how it helped them. And that's sticking that Lisa mentioned, how sometimes when you're taking medication, not only do you have to stay on it, but it's a different experience than going through a therapy. And I think that Leah's clip here really speaks to how she learned coping skills that she's continuing to use after her therapy has ended to keep her feeling that she controls the PTSD rather than PTSD controlling her. The next slide shows you on About Face. We also have kind of mixed media presentations where we have 3 veterans speak to their experiences, where they really like share examples from their worksheets and homework and notebooks. They actually, in the prolonged exposure piece, you see a veteran doing an exposure, one of his activities, to actually live that experience with him, so you can see what you will expect when you go through one of these evidence-based psychotherapies. And so this is Chris Taylor, who's a US Army veteran, and really graciously shared his experiences as the other veterans have. Okay, next slide. Again, I also mentioned that we have providers speaking to what the experience of treatment is like. And this is Dr. Sonia Norman, who also happens to work at the National Center for PTSD. Not all of the clinicians on About Face do, but I wanted to share this clip because I think you can see how Dr. Norman's presentation of what PE is overlaps very much with Lisa's that you heard today, and how well providers can both explain the nuts and bolts of these therapies, but also maybe there's one provider who says something a little bit different that helps grab you and help you really understand the treatment better. Seeing a presentation like this on a website might be helpful. So go ahead and play Sonia's clip.
So with prolonged exposure, the idea is that people who get PTSD after trauma are the ones who really avoided thinking about the experience of the trauma after it happened. They don't want to think about it. They start to avoid the memories, and then that expands to avoiding people, places, any situation that reminds them of it. And so the idea with PE is to stop avoiding, to start doing the things that they haven't been doing, and start thinking about the memory, to process it and process any feelings that came up at the time that kind of got cut off, with the idea that then there'll be recovery, and you'll start to feel better. And it's very effective and works in most cases. So part of what happens with that avoidance process is avoidance kind of snowballs on itself. So someone might say, if I go to this grocery store when it's crowded, it's going to be, I won't be able to watch everyone. Something dangerous might happen, and I won't be able to see it in advance. And so they have to go to the store, and they start getting nervous, and they start getting more nervous, and then they get in the store, and it feels heart racing, eyes blinded and sweating, and this is ridiculous, I can't do this, and they leave. And so what happens when they leave? They immediately feel relief and they feel better. And so it's easy to say to yourself, the way to feel better is to avoid. Next time I won't even go near the store. And so the avoidance kind of grows and grows, and I see people who start saying, well, I won't even go when it's not so crowded, I won't go at all, I'll get the groceries delivered. And I mean, literally sometimes we see people who haven't left their house barely in years because the avoidance just snowballs on itself. So what we start to do in prolonged exposure, we don't throw someone right into a big store at the busiest hour, but we start gradually moving toward doing those avoided things again in a safe way.
And I think one of the things that's really great about these kind of clips is you hear providers speak to experiences of other patients they've seen that help normalize some of the emotions, experiences, avoidance, symptoms that you may be feeling, to know that you are not alone, and that other people have been through this, and that your provider is aware of that, regardless of what your trauma has been. They're willing to step you through it in a way that is useful for you. not just read a protocol and knock things out, check them off a list. I have 2 more clips that I want to share that are just really helping you understand how Lisa mentioned, these treatments, they have a protocol and a process, but they're also individualized to kind of meet you where you're at and help you identify your own preferences and goals. And so there is some wiggle room in the treatments for this. So the next slide is Dr. Juliette Harik, and she speaks to how it is that treatment works kind of in general. So go ahead and play this one.
When you have PTSD, it can be really hard to imagine that things can get better, and that after a course of therapy that lasts only 12 weeks, you might actually feel different and get back some of those parts of yourself that you lost, that have been missing since the trauma. But treatments work, and I know this not just because there's 20 plus years of research telling us that these treatments work and can improve PTSD symptoms, but I know this because I've seen it happen to the veterans that I work with, people who didn't think that there's any way that they could recover from PTSD, that they could really move on past their trauma, and then they do.
Yeah, I think Juliette really speaks graciously about the compassion and empathy that providers bring to the treatment experience for their patients. So, and then the last clip that I wanted to show, I think this really speaks to something that Lisa mentioned as well. This is Dr. Laura Gibson, and she talks a little bit about how the goals of treatment may differ based upon your values and your needs. And so this is a really great clip too. Go ahead, Lisa.
Almost everybody who comes to treatment wants to reduce their symptoms. So a goal for most people would be to reduce the frequency and intensity of their PTSD symptoms. But most people also have a whole host of other goals. So those goals might be learning to tolerate sitting in a college classroom, or learning to tolerate taking my child to the fair when there are crowds around, or learning to sleep without sleep medication, or reducing my drinking. So goals, again, will be really individually tailored to your needs and what you're wanting to focus on.
Yeah, so a really reaffirming clip that your provider will work with you to identify those goals or be open to you explaining those goals as targets for therapy. So the last few slides that I want to present are really kind of the bread and butter. I think About Face is excellent for a whole host of reasons. But as Lisa mentioned towards the end of her discussion, shared decision-making is really a critical piece to getting the treatment that you want, that you feel works best for you, getting to know your provider, and feeling like you have a relationship with your provider where you're both working towards the same end. And our PTSD treatment decision aid is the best resource we have, where you can both learn about effective treatment options. It's organized into the 3 main sections that I have there: learn, compare, and act. We have a flow that will take you through the decision aid, or you can skip around in the decision aid to find the content that interests you, or go back and forth if you spend a bit of time and you want to come back at a later time. What's really great about the treatment decision aid, it also includes some video content. It's got a lot of interactive tools, and I'll show you an example of a couple of those. But at the end, you can print or save a personalized summary of your symptoms, your goals, your treatment preferences. Print that out and bring it to your provider and say, this is what I want. This is, I've done my homework, I've looked around, and you'll see that we've tried to make it user-friendly in a way that is familiar to online shopping in other venues of your life. So the next slide, this shows you one of the interactive graphics, and I'm not going to go through the interactive piece of it, but I just want to explain to you what happens. So there's education alone in the standstill graphic here, where, as Lisa mentioned, the 2 primary spheres of of best treatments, those trauma-focused psychotherapies. And if you click on the text in this graphic when you're in the decision aid, it will pop out language that gives you a definition, and then it links you to videos where providers talk about each of these things if you're interested, and likewise for the medications. And then there's other material in here that will show you the less evidence-based, less strongly recommended therapies and treatments that are available if one of these isn't right for you. So it's not limited to these therapies, but it does highlight them. And then the next slide. This is that interactive kind of preferences consumer choice piece. What we've done is we've created a grid that identifies across the top, you see the main therapies, and you can click that X and remove any of them. So say, you know, like prolonged exposure, not for me, love Lisa, but not going to do that therapy. You can click the X and it'll remove it from the chart. You can always add it back, but then it goes through a series of questions. What type of treatment is it? How does it work? What will I do? Is it effective? All sorts of questions that will help you compare these different treatments. And then those little thumbs up, if you like that, you can click it and it'll highlight it so that when you print it out, you'll have a visual of the pieces of each of the treatments that you compared and the features of those treatments that you like. And again, some of the data here, you're seeing the numbers are a little bit different. This is being updated as we speak. So by the end of the next fiscal year, this will be even more nuanced as we're updating it alongside updates that are happening to the clinical practice guideline. So we don't just create these products and let them sit. We do have our experts go back and redo them. But kind of a really neat way. And those little film icons, again, if you want a little refresher information, you can access those video clips again by clicking on those. And then it walks you through how to print this out, how to save a screenshot of it so that you can take it with you to your provider. And so, you know, for providers in VA, but any provider, if they come to the decision aid, we actually have a guide that helps providers use this decision aid with their patients, with their clients. And so for those of you who may be providers on the call, or those of you thinking, oh, providers will have no idea what I'm talking about, we do work to market these products with providers and help them work with you if they can't do it in a session, to know where you're coming from when you're using this as something to support your learning and your preference exploration. Okay, and I think that's the last slide, Lisa. Oh no, we've got the apps. How dare I forget the apps? I didn't want to go through any of the apps specifically, but I have a link here that'll take you to our suite of apps. I identified PTSD Coach last time. What I do want to note is that our really techie savvy gurus at the National Center, in partnership with both folks at the Department of Defense and other agencies, have created a suite of what we call treatment companion apps. These apps are intended to be downloaded both by you and your provider, and they do everything from track your symptoms to help you remember what homework you have in between sessions, to actually reminding you of what appointments you have coming up. You could see that there's one for cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure. We also have one for that cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia that we mentioned, as well as another therapy that can be used for PTSD or stress in general. And then the next slide, there are a number of apps that we have on our website for problems that are related to PTSD. And I mentioned COVID Coach last time we spoke. We have a couples coach. So the intention here is that both you and your partner, if you have PTSD or perhaps both of you have been through a trauma, there are relationship exercises here. And we'll dig into this one a little bit more the next time we meet. There's an app to help you quit smoking. Rates of smoking are higher among those who have PTSD, higher in veterans in general. Insomnia Coach is another one that helps you manage sleep hygiene, so good sleep behaviors, but also helps you set timers, help you track when you're sleeping, help you track when you're waking up, why you're waking up, dreams you may be having, things like that, so that you can work on those on your own or with a provider. There's a lot. And I think that's the last slide. So again, I'd love to give Lisa time to speak to any of these products. I mean, she uses them with her clients, she uses them in her practice. And of course, any questions you may have, we're happy to answer them.
So Lisa, Ann, and Rebecca, this has been incredibly informative. Really, just want to say thank you so much. We do have time for questions and answers. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Virginia Oyama, who is a social worker here at Voices. She's known to many of you on the call, and she's going to help with this as well. So if you have questions for our two experts, we would encourage you to use the chat box. You can put them in and we'll read those questions to our presenters. But Virginia, do you have anything that you want to ask just to get the ball rolling?
To get the ball rolling, I would like to thank you both for an excellent presentation, all the information that you provided. I think that you gave us all lots of resources to help cope with PTSD. And I liked very much, Lisa, how you emphasized that that finding an appropriate treatment plan is a joint discussion, a very honest, straightforward discussion with the service provider about what's going to be the best treatment options for you and what fits with your life. But just listening to so many of our people, I wonder what kinds of suggestions you have for people in terms of finding qualified providers, because it sounds wonderful the way you're describing it, but I don't know that that's the reality for many people. So I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit more. Okay.
So I think there are ways for you to find quality providers. It takes time and effort. I will not lie there. So I think part of it is to ask about your therapist's qualifications. Another thing is to go to places where they train providers in these treatments, and they will have a roster of providers who they've trained. Hopefully some of them are living where you're living, and they have it typically by state. So one large organization that say trains for prolonged exposure is the Center for the Treatment and Study of Anxiety at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And so they have a list of providers who have been trained by them.
Mm-hmm.
So reach out to them, see if anyone is in your city, and then reach out to them as providers to see if they have any openings in their caseload. That's one way to go about it. Another is to go to organizations that focus on cognitive behavioral therapy. So part of that can be an organization like ABCT, which is the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. They have a list of providers that you can access who have been typically trained in cognitive behavioral therapies. So you can comb through some of them to see if people have been trained in PE or CPT.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The Find a Provider page that we have has links to a number of those organizations that Lisa mentioned, and we're also adding the roster she mentioned for providers who've been trained in prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. And I believe we have EMDR up there already. So
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we do have a list of resources also through Voices of some therapists too that specialize in EMDR. So that's another possibility. But I know that finding the right fit is always a challenge for people. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about, you were talking about avoidance of moving on from the trauma and avoiding thinking about it or going places that would bring the experience back. I wonder if you could speak about the experience of going along for many years and feeling like you're doing okay, and then the experience coming up that something triggers the person and they're right back as if they had never left the trauma. And that can be several years later, and what that experience is like for someone and what you recommend.
Well, I feel like that experience is always really difficult. We find that fairly often with people who have had roles that are really important in their lives over the years since the trauma. So that might be a job as a caretaker to children, even in particular roles in your family that might be really important and take up a lot of time and energy. And then when, for whatever reason, things like retirement or a child going off to college or something like that, now the thing that sort of took up so much of someone's time, right? And avoidance doesn't necessarily have to be something bad.
Right.
It can just be that you're not engaging in your life in a way where you are in touch with these memories. And in fact, when they come, you push them away. But once you push them away, you could be doing something proactive in your life, like spending time with kids or exercising or doing something else. It's a healthy behavior that everyone from the outside might look and say like, oh yeah, they're functioning really well. Look at them, right? They ran a marathon, or they're their class mom for all their kids' classes, right? Or any of those things. So it's important to recognize it doesn't always look like you're strong arming something away. It can just mean a really high level of engagement so that you don't have to attend to the trauma experience. And so oftentimes when something happens to sort of take that experience away, like a child going to college or retirement from a job, people's symptoms return, right? If your number one coping is avoidance by doing this thing, and then we take away that thing, then there goes your coping. And so what we know, and the good news is that it's a great time to go to treatment. Really, the message for PTSD treatment is it's always a great time to go to treatment. And it's always the right time to engage in an evidence-based treatment. So if you come in and you explain to your provider about what's going on and about their symptoms are coming back, or maybe they were never this strong to begin with and you're feeling something distinctly different than before, you get a good assessment for PTSD with someone who specializes in PTSD. And then you talk about what treatment options might be a good fit for you right now. And then from there, you'll be able to proceed with treatment. The good news is that there's no data that shows us that a delayed onset or this reoccurrence of symptoms that you would have any less of a positive effect in therapy. The therapy works just as well. And so we encourage you all to engage in the therapy as best as you can, whenever you are willing.
Whenever you can. That's a very hopeful message and a very, significant message that whenever you're ready for treatment, that's the right time. And it can be effective up the road as much as it can be effective early on. Thank you for that. Maybe Lisa, you could also talk a little bit about what do you see as differences in people that you have been engaged in treatment with, who come in with symptoms and decide on a plan, and then what their life might look like 5 months up the road or something. I always think that's good for people to hear.
I can speak to my own experience of when you're that therapist, right? There's a reason I really love being a PTSD specialist. And I've talked about this with Rebecca a bunch, which is you see people get well all the time. When you are a provider who does evidence-based treatments all the time, and you saw the slide that more than half of the people no longer meet clinical criteria for PTSD. So that means that they're not meeting the clinical criteria. That doesn't mean that they have a quality of life increase. That is in way more than 53%, over 50% of the people who engage in these treatments. And so we see people getting better all the time. So look, it's one thing to check off the difference between, I sometimes avoid to almost never avoid. And for people in those measures, those are the clinical things as providers and data nerds like me that are important, right? But for people, what that translates to is being able to go to your child's or grandchild's baseball or football game, right? Being able to be there at Thanksgiving dinner for the whole day, right? Being able to go to a family reunion or a vacation that the people who love you have asked you to go on for 10 or 20 years, and you've always found the excuse not to go. And this year you decide to go, those milestones, those wins are, I know they recharge my battery as the provider, but also for the person are so distinctly life-changing. I cannot tell you how many vacation pictures I had in my office when I worked at the New Orleans VA that I never went on those vacations, but my patients did, right? And they would send me pictures, and really their families would be so incredibly thankful about the change in perspective that their loved one has. And those are things that are, priceless, even though I know finding therapy on the outside with someone who is outside of the VA with someone who's well trained in PTSD work can be expensive, but the experience of having your life back is truly priceless.
And Virginia, I can say too, I mean, Lisa's experience, I mean, it speaks to her skills as a provider. And on the About Face website, there are some mini documentaries that are like 5 to 10 minutes long, where veterans have shared their story about getting into treatment and then what their life is like now. And as Lisa mentioned, for many of them, it's like starting a career, or it's reconnecting with family, or it's giving back to others who have been through PTSD and need treatment. And so if you're inclined to really hear some of those success stories, really that are about, you can see the emotion, it's palpable in the stories they share, and they're real people who have generously opened the door into their life to see how treatment changed them.
Yeah, you can't watch About Face without like a box of tissues next to you. It's just everyone is just so generous with their experience, and to hear from providers who, I know it is hard, right? If you are not a provider, to know what it is like on the other side of the desk, or maybe if you're doing it virtually on the other side of the screen, but to hear what it's like for them to do these treatments with people, and the hopes that they have for you, and the desire for you to be well is also something I think that's really important to hear, that you're on the same team as your provider, and it's you and them versus PTSD.
Yeah.
It's not two different teams.
That's wonderful. And I think that a lot of what we experience here through Voices is people coming together and supporting each other in that journey, and the being able to, re-engage in life with a joy and a sense of purpose and meaning. And that's very significant. And many people giving back is also another way that is evidenced in their lives. So thank you for what you presented. Leanne, I don't know if you have any questions in the chats that you want to share.
We had a question about whether information from the presentation would be made available. And I just commented that we do have a couple of handouts from our presenters that we will email to everyone on the call, so that you'll all have that. I also want to thank Lisa Ann and Rebecca for another really just super informative presentation. The first two parts of the series have been terrific, and we really look forward to the next session, which I'd like to remind everyone. Lisa?
I just noticed that Carolyn has a question though.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that. Let's see.
She snuck one in there.
Okay. Does prolonged exposure and its success give credence to the idiom "get back on the old horse"?
I mean, I think that's a great way to describe it, but in some ways it's almost like, can you see the old horse, right? Because for many people, their trauma, we don't want them to go back to a place that is actually dangerous, right? We want them to be able to differentiate between what is actually dangerous and not, right? So for example, this idea of, being able to revisit their trauma experience. For some instance, say it is a war zone, which is lots of veterans we treat, but also at this point, lots of civilians who come to the US and are here and are refugees. Many of our providers are treating too and have war zone experiences different than combat. And so we want people in prolonged exposure to be able to differentiate between, being in the street in a place that is actually dangerous and being in the street in a place that is it is highly unlikely that something terrible would happen. And so part of that is to think about, it's almost this idea of, yes, go back to the things, if we're talking about how do you engage in real life exposures, like going back to the store, but it's also with that knowledge that we are in a different place, and this is uniquely different from that experience of trauma. And whether that place means literally physical place or sort of like time and experience. But yeah, I think you're sort of on the right track, Carolyn, which is like, yes, there's this ability to go back to, can you do what you used to do before with a new perspective?
I think perhaps we have time maybe for one last question. We agree certainly with Jean that this was an excellent presentation, but there's a question about any recommendations for certifying emotional therapy dogs.
So here is what is true related to PTSD and emotional support, or emotional support animals, which is that right now there is no empirical support that it helps reduce the symptoms of PTSD. Now, here's what we also know about animals. I've never had a pet, but what Rebecca tells me, because she is a pet lover, right, is this idea that it brings a lot of meaning to people's lives. And it helps you connect with something that you are responsible for, it helps you connect in a relationship. Those are all fabulous things. And those things are not things that decrease the symptoms of PTSD. But it doesn't mean that they're not important things for you to have in your life. So both are true, that dogs don't treat PTSD in a way that is effective, or emotional support animals don't, but it doesn't mean that they don't bring joy and happiness to your life. And we would want you, obviously, to have that experience if that's something you want. It just isn't emotional support for PTSD.
If any of you would like to take yourselves off of mute just to say goodbye or thank you, I think that would be a lovely way for us to end today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Good rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Bye-bye.
And Rebecca. It's been
Great
wonderful.
to see you all
Thank
today.
you. See you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Be well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.